All right. Hey everyone. My name's Inuk Jørgensen. I'm a filmmaker from Greenland, based in Sweden, where I teach film at Nordiska Filmskolan, just outside of Göteborg, Gothenburg. Today's lecture will be about story structure. A story structure in the short form, because that I think would be mostly relevant for what you guys are making. I personally am very fascinated by short films. I really think it's an awesome format to be able to tell stories that are condensed. And many of the same rules, if you will, apply to short films. That apply to short films also apply to longer films or novels or any story basically. And that's also worth remembering for you guys well, some of the rules that I'll be talking about when talking about the 3x structure and so on, they're actually not rules as though many people talk about them as rules. They're more a set of guidelines that hopefully when you're done with this lecture, you pick and choose what you want and you pick the best things, which is mostly relevant for you. And not just because I am telling you so or someone else is telling you to do things a certain way. Because remember, what you do is yours, it's your film, and it's you who should be exploring these opportunities. But when it comes to story structure, a lot of research have actually been done throughout a very long time. And there are some general universal things that are found in almost every story, be it film, literature, or oral presentation, which is very big where I come from in Greenland, because the Inuit didn't have a writing language, a language for writing down stuff until the Danish came or the Scandinavians came and colonized Greenland. But the oral tradition has lived on for a long time, and many peoples around the world have used this form of storytelling for a very long time. What's interesting is that even though you go thousands of years back, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So if you can make your short film have a beginning, a middle, and an end, you will have done a good job, basically. But if we dig a little deeper, there are some more fine-tuned structures that come into play when you think about story structure. I mean, some of you, if you've analyzed film in school, you may have come across the Hollywood model, as it's called in English, with a very noticeable curve. That's a very handy tool if you want to use it, because it also talks about the three structures. There's a climax and there's an introduction to everything. So please use that if you know it. But what I want to talk about today is four different ways of looking at story. Right. So I want to simplify the Hollywood model a little bit and talk about the 3x structure, which is basically a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? I'll be coming back to that a lot in this lecture. And then I also want to touch upon Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, while I also mention Dan Harmon's story circle. I mean, they're both, if you Google them, you will see a circle. Right, and that circle is basically their way of constructing the story. But I'll get back to that in this video. So I will mix those two circles, Dan Harmon's story circle and Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and see if I can combine them into a simplified version of what they're actually saying. Simplified because I really think that story structure can be very annoying. I mean, I know that from my own perspective. When I make films, that thinking about story may not be the most interesting thing, but it's if you make it simple and easy to apply, then it can be a great tool that I use myself also in my own productions. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about a theory put forth by a film theorist called John York. You can also Google him. I will talk a little bit about something that he calls the Midpoint Collection. Midpoint Collision, right? Because in his theory, a lot of stories in film, at least, they somehow have a midpoint where everything collides and something new comes out of it. But I'll get back to that as I go through the different theories. So hopefully you will come away from this lecture with some tools that you can apply when you make your short films or your projects. And hopefully this will help you make more engaging stories, because at least in Joseph Campbell's example with from the hero's journey, this is based on thousands and thousands of stories that Joseph Campbell and his team have collected from everywhere in the world, right? And they have analyzed what is the general story. And he and his team came up with this idea of the hero's journey. What that basically means is, and this is also the introduction to your first small assignment in this lecture, is that every story has a hero or a heroine or someone who is the main character, the protagonist. And every story has some kind of protagonist that has a drive, that wants to do something. Whether it be good or not good, I mean evil. Usually it's a protagonist that is good-hearted, so we can feel empathy with that person. Every story, every good story, so according to Joseph Campbell at least, has a conflict. Usually that could be good versus evil, right? Frodo versus Sauron. Or, it could be a love story, right? Where girl meets boy, but something comes in the way, right? So all stories basically have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a main character and a conflict, right? And that's basically it. Thank you for today. No, I'm kidding. No, to be more serious, right? If you spend 5 to 8 minutes, I want you to think about your favorite film. It can be any film, right? Think about your favorite film. And I want you to make a list, write it down, right? And I want you to answer 3 questions, right? So 1, who is the main character? 2, what drives the main character? So what kind of motivation does the main character have, which drives the story forward? Yeah. And lastly, I want you to write down what is the main conflict of the story. The good versus evil, or the conflict is something that prohibits the main character in achieving what he or she wants. Okay, so 3 things: main character, what drives the main character, and what's the conflict of the story. So pause this video, come back in 8 minutes and have a list of this. Oh, so you're back. Sorry, I just gotta get more coffee. So, sorry, excuse me. So why are these 3 things important? Well, every story needs a main character or main characters that we can follow in order to make the journey interesting, so to speak. Because generally speaking, there are some aspects that any well-told story has, and this is present pretty much in all films. Remember that film is both an art form but also a business. So in order to make money, a lot of films need to be engaging, otherwise we wouldn't buy the tickets to go into the cinema, right? So they need to be telling an interesting story. So if you continue this train of thought, you can ask yourself, what happens in the beginning of your favorite film, right? Usually you are introduced to the main character and the main problem, the main conflict, right? And you also get a sense of what drives this main character, right? There is something that he or she really wants. If it's a romantic comedy, it's usually that the boy or the girl really wants to get to know a boy or a girl in a romantic way, right? If it's a superhero film, then we also get introduced to the villain in the beginning. And usually the main character, which is usually the good one, wants to overcome the evil, right? So this is usually in the first part of the story. And then we have the second part of the story, which is usually a little longer, but I'll get back to that in just a minute, right? And in this middle part of the story, we get a build-up of the conflict between good and evil that was introduced in the first part of the story, right? Here we may meet different worlds, a lot of other small problems along the way, but basically what happens in the rest of the film was introduced in the beginning, right? As the story of the film, or any story basically, moves forward, it gets more and more exciting, and it leads up to a climax, which is in the third act of the story, in the last part of it, right? And here the hero and the villain, which were introduced in the first part of the story, they have their final battle. So everything has been leading up to this point, right? Where good versus evil, they finally meet and they battle out this big thing, or the boy and the girl, they have to overcome some kind of conflict in order for them to fall in love and live happily ever after and all that, right? And that is basically the premise of any story. And if you have that in mind, as I will say in also just a minute, this can help you in constructing everything you're doing with film, right? If you need to introduce what the film is about, you need to explore the conflict, and you need to have some kind of resolution, some kind of climax in the end. And it doesn't have to be that the good people are winning. It could also be that the bad guys are winning. It doesn't really matter. It's the same structure. And you can apply this to fiction as well as documentary filming or something in between, right? It doesn't have to be hardcore fiction or hardcore facts. You can mix that, right? But a structure is very helpful, not just for you as a filmmaker, but maybe even more so for your audience, the people watching what you are making. Yeah. So I want to show you a little bit more in depth about what all this means here on the computer. So bear with me here. Okay, so as I said, right, I'll be talking about three ways of looking at story, where one of them is actually a composite of two different things. But if we begin with what I started this lecture on, right, we have the 3-act structure. The first act, introduction, you get introduced to everything that's going to happen, right? The main character, the main villain if you have one, or the main problem, the main conflict. And you also introduce the world of your film, or the world of your story, right? So if you're filming this in Iceland, you will introduce this. I mean, this could just be an image of where you're filming, or if you're filming this in a forest in Norway, you will have a picture of a forest, right? It doesn't have to be that explained, right? In the act number 2, you have the confrontation and the conflict, right? So if you're like making a film on climate change, maybe you introduce the problem or the conflict in act 1, And in Act 2, you get to explore why this is a conflict, from where you are, right? And in Act 3, it ends with, yeah, well, it can end in a lot of different ways, but some kind of resolution to that conflict. Along the way, there are some points where, if you really get into this 3-act structure, right? So usually there's a point in the very beginning of the story, like the first incident, enticing incident, which makes the whole story roll on, right? Then after that, there's something called a plot point. A plot point is where you go from the introduction into the actual confrontation, right? If you think about the film Titanic, which is not a short film, but a very long film, this could be, I'm presuming that you've watched Titanic. It's one of those films everyone's seen, right? But this could be where Jack and Rose meet at the back of the ship that cold night, where Rose is actually thinking about jumping off the Titanic, right? This leads into the second act, which is about the conflict. I mean, Rose and Jack falling in love, but Rose is supposed to be married to someone else and all that. And at the midpoint of say Titanic, right? If you think about what happens, like if you watch it and you pause it, it's right in the middle, like after 1.5 hours. It's a very long film, right? At that point, that's the exact minute where the ship hits the iceberg. Yeah, and this is no coincidence. I mean, the people who wrote Titanic, they very, very good people, good at writing, right? And so they put the most important thing that happens in Titanic at the very middle. So Titanic goes from being a romantic comedy almost to being, well, almost a scary movie. And this changes at the mid of the story, right? Then a lot of things happen, blah, blah, blah. You have the second plot point. And if we stick to Titanic, the whole thing, the second plot point is how Jack and Rose eventually decide not to go into the lifeboats. And then you have a climax of the film. Do they get each other? Will they not get each other? What happens to Rose's fiance and all that? Because we all know what happens to the ship Titanic, right? So yeah, so that's a little bit of a spoiler for all of those of you who haven't seen it, but still not completely. So you can apply this to even a short film. I mean, this is many points along the way, so this could be a little distracting. Spend 8 minutes and see if you can figure out how your idea is structured. And if it's a complete mess, which if you start like me, everything's a complete mess, see if you can put them into some kind of Act 1 with an introduction to the whole thing, and an Act 2 where you dig deeper into the conflict, the confrontation that you want to follow, and an Act 3 where you have a climax and some sort of ending to your short film and your project, basically, right? Pause the video, come back in 8 minutes, and I'll see you then. If we move on to talk about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey or Dan Harmon's story circle, both of these theories are based on a story moving in a circular motion, right? Here I wrote the heroine's journey, right? Because this is basically my own mix of both Dan Harmon's theory and Joseph Campbell's theory, right? So if we begin at 12 o'clock up there, right? There's the start of the story, the beginning of the story. Our main character, let's say it's this girl, she has a dream, and her dream is to win the I don't know, the Olympic Games. No, a triathlon. She wants to compete in a triathlon, right? So that's the main character. We also see her world. She is leaving home to start this incredible journey of hers. So there's a call to action, right? The adventure begins. But as the film and the story progresses, our main character in this example, right? She meets some obstacles on the way, right? And she doesn't know what to do about them. Okay, what do I need to do in order to win a triathlon, which is my dream, right? Well, I have to learn to swim. And so the different trials begin, right? She has to work out and train in different categories in order to become proficient enough to win a triathlon, right? And at 6 o'clock in the middle of the story, remember that the midpoint was a very important point, right? She is confronting the biggest challenge. And, you know, just when you thought everything could not get any worse, she has to battle, I don't know, in this case, she has to climb a huge mountain, right? In The Lord of the Rings, right, there's a huge battle in the middle of all the 3 films, because this is where you as an audience need to feel like, oh no, I don't know, how could this ever end well, right? So that's the point of this midpoint, right? In order to get out of this huge crisis that our main character is in, we have to start working to gain strength in some way. If we go back to our girl in this example, right? She has now learned that in order to climb a big mountain and in order to be a good swimmer, she has to work out, build up her muscles, so to speak, right? And through her training, through her gaining strength or gaining knowledge or something, she eventually figures out learning new skills and how to overcome these different trials and obstacles, right? And in this case, she learns to surf the waves, right? And from what she has learned throughout her journey has made her so strong and so good at whatever she is doing that she eventually wins the whole thing and returns home. So this circle is a very simplified idea of both Dan Harmon's story circle and Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, right? So there's a beginning. There's a call to adventure. Something is just too, the main character can't keep it in. They have to pursue the dream. Along the way to get to that dream, there are obstacles. There are many trials, many small issues that they have to overcome. There's a huge battle. And this huge battle is only won by gaining strength. And once this strength or these new skills have been learned, our hero can now win that battle and return home. Yeah? If you want to know more about both the story circle and the hero's journey, you can Google them, look them up on YouTube. There are thousands of videos and thousands of resources explaining this in more detail. The last theory I want to touch upon, which is not really a theory, but this is something I borrowed from a guy named John York, right? And this is a very simplified version of his book. It's something called the Midpoint Collision, right? So, as we've learned, the middle of the story needs to carry some kind of weight. And especially in short films, this can be a great way of thinking about your story. So you have a beginning, you have a middle with a very strong midpoint, and then you have some kind of end, right? Think back to your favorite film. And once again, it could be any film, right? It could be the same film as in the first assignment, right? I want you to think back and think, is there a point in the film where it seems the darkest, where the biggest battle of the film is, or where we think that the heroes are just about to lose before they start gaining this new skill and so on? Most likely there is such a point, and most likely this point is probably in the very middle of the film. Next time you watch a film, pause it in the middle and think about what that scene is actually doing to the whole story. The example with Titanic, right? During the very minute, which is in the middle of the film, after 90 something minutes, right? This is where the iceberg hits the ship. And as I said, this is no coincidence, right? This midpoint collision is very important and can be a way for you, if you're making a short film, to have something happen here that changes your short film, right? Usually in short film, you don't have a lot of time in explaining a lot of complex story things, right? Story issues, and you can't go into detail that much because you haven't got that much time. But in short films, I find this midpoint very, very useful. Let's say you're doing a film on climate change, right? Maybe you could start the film by telling how it was before climate change happened, right? And then at the middle of the film, you could change your film into what is happening now that climate change is going on, for instance. So because a short film is usually quite short, it's an easy way to have a very, very interesting story structure by having the film change or having something happen in the middle that, for the audience at least, changes their perspective on the film. Okay, so I hope that this confusing part of the lecture gives you a little bit of an idea of how you could use the different theories on story in your own projects. And remember, once again, this is theory, right? You don't have to use everything. But this brings us to the next assignment in this lecture, right? Spend 8 minutes, 5 to 8 minutes to go over your idea or your ideas for this workshop and think about what you want to pursue. What is your film going to be about? Do you have a point? Maybe you have a clear goal in mind already. And this could be, if you're making a documentary, I mean, the main character could be yourself, not explaining, but looking at some kind of issue on global warming or something, right? But think about your idea. Is there a major turning point in your story? And is it possible to have this major turning point in the middle of your story? Think about that for 8 minutes. Pause this video and come back. Okay, welcome back. This is no easy process. I mean, story structure can be very hard to figure out. And remember that a lot of the masters of storytelling, I mean, the great filmmakers of the world, they didn't set out being great masters. I mean, everything we do in film, we base on learning by doing. So in a way, you guys are the heroes and the heroines of your own story, in a way, right? Which is a very interesting way of thinking about it. So in many ways, these theories about story are nothing more than that. I mean, they're just theories. Theories on which you can build a story. You don't have to do it, especially not in the short film. But I know from own experience, as I said, this has helped me in creating a more structured line of events that leads up to my conclusion in my short films. And this has been very useful for me, both in my own short films, but also the things I do for clients. I mean, it could be from commercials to the way you build up a music videos that I used to do like many years ago, right? But if you think of it as a beginning, a middle, and an end, this will help you quite a lot along the way, right? Because remember, in filmmaking, you also have to think about camera, you have to think about lights, you have to think about sound, and there's a million things that you have to think about. So you really shouldn't make this harder on yourself. And if your story does not have a very driven character, it does not mean it's wrong. I mean, you can't go wrong, right? But so think of this as a helpful tool, not as a rule of that you have to follow, right? Pick and choose what you can and leave the rest and start making your own film, right? But let's talk about what we did in the very beginning of this lecture, right? So 3 things, right? Character, drive, and conflict. Because these 3 things should be in your story. Because that will make the audience, people who are watching your film, engaged in what you want to show them. Think of it like this, so like in the beginning of your text, you want to introduce the world of your film, or in the beginning of your film, you want to introduce the world of your film. But you also need to have the film be about something, right? If it's a film about nothing, chances are that people may not find it that interesting. Chances are that you who are making this may not find it that interesting. And if you can, at the halfway point, see if you can make that very central part of your story. See if you can make it interesting in some way. I mean, in some short films, it's just a different way of using the camera, or there's a certain sound, or the music changes. I mean, it can be very subtle things that can help you get this structure of a beginning, middle, and an end, right? Maybe your film ends happily, and the main characters live happily ever after, or they don't. That's not really the point. But the point is that if you think about structure, even as you think about what project to do, chances are that you will be have a better experience, for one, because it will be more fun, more challenging. Remember, we are all the heroes of our own journeys, right? And in order to get to our goal, making a film, we have challenges to overcome, and this demands something of us, exactly like it does of the heroes and the heroines in our stories. Yeah, I think that is pretty much it. If you want to know more about story structure, I mean, there's a million books out there. You can Google it, and luckily now that YouTube has gone as big as it is, you can Google and YouTube stuff, then just write in hero's journey or story circle or 3X or film or story structure, and you can get a lot of information very quickly and for free, which is very nice. So please do that. And for me, I hope this was very helpful, and if it wasn't, please let me know, because I really think that structuring the story is both important, but it's also very interesting for me to see how people are doing it, because even though the rules are the same, and we all approach them differently, and for me that is very interesting. So yeah, I hope you learned something. I hope this inspired you to at least think about these things, and the best of luck to you all. So thank you for listening to me for this lecture. Good luck. Hey.